Good afternoon or good morning for those joining us from the United States. My name is Mohanad Hage. I'm a senior fellow at Hage Carnegie Middle East Center. I'm here to moderate a panel on the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq. 20 years on from the invasion, this remains one of the most decisive moments in the modern history of the region as a whole, let alone Iraq, of course. In Iraq and beyond, the invasion unleashed sectarian tensions and violence, a fresh wave of militancy, and most importantly, reshuffled regional politics in a dramatic fashion with the rise of Iran as a regional hegemon. In the panel today with me are esteemed speakers, Dr. Akeel Abbas, an Iraqi academic and journalist, Dr. Marsin Alshumary, a research fellow with the Middle East Initiative, and Dr. Zeinab Shuker, an assistant professor of sociology at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas. We'll start with the panel right away with the panelists and the discussion. Marsin, I wanted to start with you. This was a decisive moment in Iraq's history, but also a kind of a driving force for rather limiting narratives and politics in the region. 2 decades on, how do you reflect and how do you view that moment's impact, and how does the invasion still shape Iraqi politics and narratives? Marsin, please.
I think it's unquestionable that it was a foundational moment in Middle Eastern history, and one of those moments that will be forever in history books. It really transformed the region. It changed regional politics, and its repercussions are with us today. There's so many impacts of this invasion that I can talk about. Regionally, of course, I think many people have come away from this invasion thinking that the biggest winner has been Iran because of its increased influence in Iraq and the elimination of its biggest rival in the region at the time, Saddam Hussein, who had waged a war against Iran. So that's one of the biggest regional shifts that we've seen. Of course, this had repercussions. Ironically, it was a war supposedly waged in order to stem terrorism, but it created an incubator of terrorism in the country. I think any Iraqi you would have talked to at the time prior to 2003 would have laughed at the idea that Iraq had terrorism within it or that it had any ties to Al-Qaeda. But somehow that argument was pushed through American foreign policy circles. And, the endless labyrinth that is American foreign policy making at the time is an entirely different discussion. But I think one worth having perhaps later on in this discussion, maybe in other venues. But it did ultimately unleash waves of terrorism upon Iraq, its citizens, and neighboring countries. These incubators of terrorism had far-reaching consequences, waves of migration, many lives lost, of course, potential lost. And it really did change in the region as well, perceptions of what sectarianism meant in the region, of what identity meant in the region, and it polarized identity lines as well. I mean, the very big Iranian-Saudi struggle wouldn't have been as strong without this massive shift in Iraq. It wouldn't have been as visible or long-lasting and impactful for the region without this massive shift locally in Iraq. So I don't think anyone here would probably say anything else, but that we will always remember it, and it is a historic moment in the region.
And ironically, 20 years on, the Iran-Saudi conflict or Iran-Saudi tensions are kind of coming to an end, or there's a kind of a new phase in that relationship in the region. Of course, it's an impactful phase, but it's ironic that 20 years on, that this conflict and everything it did and all the major changes that it kind of left in the region is now 2 decades on, coming to an end, and certain, and not probably entirely to an end, but there seems to be a new phase in that relationship. And I wanted to see with you whether also, 2 decades on, what is left of that phase. I mean, the narratives within Iraq and of course the sectarian tensions and the early phases of the conflict Of course, Iraq now is in a different phase, but looking at these 2 decades and also at these regional shifts that we're seeing, and how will they impact? I mean, how do you see that impact developing in the next phase?
To be honest, I think there's different discourses about what's happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia now. There's one hand a very optimistic tale of a rapprochement between them and reconciliation after years of tension. And there's another story, you hear a lot in Washington circles actually about this not really being reflective of any true intentions at rapprochement between the two countries. So I'm going to wait and see. I will say that Iraq did play a role in whatever this amounts to be, because it did host dialogues for both countries. I don't place too much stock in ideology-based politics, but if we set that aside for a moment, I will say that one of the things that really did change in the region after 2003, and it required a lot of time for this to really manifest, is that really, for the first time in the Middle East contemporary history, do you see an Arab Shia stronghold in a country, which has never really happened before. And I think it was quite difficult for neighboring countries to become accustomed to this. There's been research conducted on the Gulf's particular alienation of Iraq and how it pushed Iraq towards Iran in that sense. And so you can really divide this time period into 2 separate eras. The first one is in which Iraq really found itself with no willing partners in the region or allies except for Iran, because of this sectarianization of politics in the region. But over time, this has fallen away because Iraq does share tremendous familiarity and similarity in customs, culture, religion, language with many countries in the region. And so it was able to slowly forge ties and to occupy what everyone says is a natural position for it as a mediator in the region. A diverse country that's able to bring many different actors together. Of course, the same can be said for Lebanon, a diverse country that is able to bring many actors together. But Iraq also is geographically positioned much closer to Iran and naturally would have the bigger role in that sense. So we've seen this transformation after the first 10 years. Today, I think Iraq is in a good place in terms of its relationship with its regional partners, regional allies. It's better than it has been in the past. Of course, there's a huge asterisk when it comes to intervention. We can get into that later. But I think the next 10 years will show even stronger ties within the region, particularly as the region itself, you can also see it moving away from a strong Washington orbit and reasserting its identity and reasserting its independence in a way that we hadn't seen in the past.
Interesting. Thank you, Marsin. Akeel, I wanted to ask you just a follow-up question on what Marsin was saying, which is the role that was initiated by Al-Kadhimi, which the former prime minister, which emanated from the concern that this conflict or this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran has impacted Iraqi politics in many ways, specifically since the invasion. And I wanted to ask whether, reflecting on that role that Iraq played, whether you saw that as also a kind of an upgrade of Iraq's role, rather than being only the recipient of the repercussions or impacted by the repercussions of that rivalry, but also taking initiative in terms of playing a regional role and trying to mediate and resolve that. Is that a kind of an upgrade in what Marsin said specifically about that Iraq now is in a different place? Do you see that that direction?
Thank you for having me here. First of all, I come from the position that this regional rivalry between Iran and Saudi reflecting negatively in Iraq in disabling ways, that it is a defining moment. I disagree with this narrative. It is greatly exaggerated, and it is used intentionally and unintentionally to shift attention from the real issues in Iraq. And these issues have to deal with corruption, ethno-sectarianism, the arrangements of power in Iraq. The failure in Iraq didn't emanate from the Iranian-Saudi rivalry. Yes, it did affect it in one way or the other, but the internal arrangements of power that emerged really after 2005 and the policies that followed that polarized society. You know, de-Baathification doesn't have anything to do with Saudi Arabia or Iran. Dividing the state into fiefdoms between different ethno-sectarian parties and, gradually really emptying the state of any meaningful content to the citizens. This doesn't have anything to do with Iran or Saudi Arabia. I think the political class in Iraq uses this as an excuse. You hear it a lot. It's like the regional powers are so negatively influencing us. There is a negative influence, no doubt. But the fragility of the Iraqi state emerged from the failure of the ruling political parties. Now, they did this deliberately or not. Of course, I'm not somebody who subscribes to conspiracy theories, but I think these parties were always factional, never developed a nationalistic sense of identity. They don't have a plan. We blame the US for not having a plan. It did have a plan. It was a poor plan. These people even don't have a plan to begin with. So this is one. Why did Kadhimi do that? For me, it's two reasons. It's just like in the US, you say foreign policy is easy to do. You escape from the challenges of domestic policy. And I think for Kadhimi, this was an element. He couldn't succeed in many of the internal challenges facing them. Against as government came, the expectations were high, powerful, entrenched interest, and in the different spheres of the state by parties that were not necessarily happy with the government the way it came. So doing foreign policy was easier, and he used his influence, his previous relations, and he achieved something. But I think what he did was very important. It did not, I don't think it will significantly contribute to the stability of Iraq, because the drivers of instability in Iraq are not, regional powers. It's Iraqi. Just the different parties and how they see their role, and they negotiate, their different deals, so on and so forth. But I think it broke a very important barrier. This whole notion of, the Iraqi state as intrinsically incapable of doing anything, of contributing positively to the region. And by the way, this was also established since 2005 and on. We cannot really help these powerful regional forces because we're so consumed with our own problems and our own fragilities and so on and so forth. But I think Kadhimi proved something else. Also, the whole idea that we have to be hostile to some other power. In Iraq, 2005, after 2005, two really opposing narratives emerged. And these were sectarian narratives, the Iranians, the Majusi, those who, since the last 1,000 years, they're always conspire against Iraq, a dominant Sunni narrative, very problematic. On the other side, there was a Shia narrative, and it was fed by Shia political parties. The other one was probably also fed by some Sunni parties. Saudis reduced to Wahhabism. Every Saudi is a Wahhabi. There's no difference between Qaeda and the Salafist religious movement in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis and the Qaeda are really one large identity. There's always the number that's used, 5,000 Saudi suicide bombers, which is not true. Actually, the number was 500. But anyhow, I think, there was this attempt to construct these essentialist narratives about others. And that these narratives basically lead to eternal, trans-historical conflicts that cannot be solved, with current tools. I think the essence of what Kadhimi did probably didn't mean it that way or think it that way, is that he undermined his narrative. He undermined this narrative, basically.
Isn't it the result of kind of the inorganic event, the inorganic change that happened, which is the invasion 20 years ago?
I'm sorry, can you say this again?
I'm saying, isn't that type of politics, these opposing narratives, zero-sum politics, and the ensuing violence that came after, were basically a result of that inorganic change in the order of things, which was the invasion?
I guess if I understand your question correctly, these primordial narratives, are these the consequences of the invasion? Are these automatic consequences? Are these inevitable consequences? I think these narratives emerged as from relying on, the problem that happened in Iraq. You don't have a framework of understanding how to solve the current problems. You have political parties, particularly Shia and Kurdish parties, that relied heavily on identity politics and investing in history. History provided a framework for understanding. So I think that played a role, and this worked a lot more on the Shia side, invoking the ghosts of the past. And on top of this Arab coldness towards Iraq, this questioning of this new force emerging in Iraq, Shiism more or less is an obscure faith. Lots of people know that Shiism is a faith, it exists, they would know one or two things about it, but it is mostly to the Arab Sunni world, it is obscure. It's difficult to understand, particularly because of its internal structures. You have mujtahids and you have followers for the mujtahid, and each mujtahid has, his way of seeing the same issue differently from another mujtahid. So it was just like an intricate set of information all thrown on the Arab world, when Iraqi Shias, many of them even didn't understand these things. So I think that the fact that those who represented Shias in Iraq and constructed this political identity, componentalism, if there is such a term, were components. And these components have to negotiate, so on and so forth. On the Shia side, they dominated, and they decided that history is the starting point. This is the framework of understanding. Salafis always hated us, Wahhabis always hated us, and the Saudi state manifests this hate. A very reductive narrative, but it suited certain purposes, and it took a while to deconstruct this narrative. And I think Kadhimi, what he did, it played an important role in deconstructing this narrative. These are human beings. This is another state that has interests, and it pursues its interests like any other state. The same thing with Iran. It's not that they're defined by what happened 1,000 years ago, and that definition is, it's determining and unchangeable, and it goes beyond place and history. I guess if I would say in one sentence, is that we are historical beings. The state is a historical being. Our interests are historical, meaning they're made by people in a certain historical context. I think that is the result that we have arrived at the end. Most of the Iraqi political class does understand it this way, and they moved, I would say, great distance from identity politics in terms of understanding others, but not in terms of power arrangements in Iraq. Identity politics is still powerful because these parties invest in it. But in terms of understanding the outside world, no, it's a lot less powerful than it used to be, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. And I think to a certain extent, what you're saying has to do with the system which was set in place, the constitutional setup, which creates that kind of politics. And I think, Lebanon is another case example that Marsin mentioned also early on in the discussion, and has a similar set of politics, and also the regional dimension is very similar. I just want to move on in the discussion just to ask Zeinab about, injury and the impact of the invasion in 2 decades of the politics which Akeel was trying to describe. Bad governance, the violence that occurred, the invasion itself, and also the ensuing violence and sectarian violence, and that collective injury. To what extent do you think this will impact the Iraqi population's ability to cope with upcoming challenges? You speak and you write about the upcoming challenges, economic and also the climate change impact, which has been quite notable in Iraq. And I wanted to see your view of that moment's impact and 2 decades of conflict and bad governance.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for this question. I think that when we speak of the 2003 moment, it's really important to situate that in a historical sort of progress. It did not come from nowhere, and it's important to understand that the injury that's impacting Iraqis since 2003, it wasn't something that was produced in 2003. There has been an injury before 2003. We're talking about a population that have witnessed a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, and a lot of distress. We are talking about a population, my family, my father, people that I know who, for example, lived in Iraq in the 70s and witnessed the political violence against any political opposition and sort of the mistrust that emerged from political parties afterwards. We were talking about a population that lived through the Iraq-Iran war and experienced that pain and that trauma and that injury. We were talking about a population that have lost, every family, probably every household in Iraq have lost someone to war at some point. We're talking about the 1991 events and war and what that did to Iraq, and then the economic sanctions and what that did. So we're talking about a people who, for a very long time, before 2003, who've been surviving and not living and thriving. And so that undermined their ability to, think and engage in state building and responding to major crises when, for a very long time, the only thing you could do is survive and try to avoid punishment from political leaders and political centers of power. And so when 2003 came, it was a continuation of trauma that Iraq has been experiencing for a very long time. And we saw that manifesting on the ground. People were seeking identity and identification with anything they can find, right? And so identity played a significant role. And instead of identifying with the nation and developing a national identity, we saw people seeking identification with different religious, ethnic, sectarian parties and groups, especially considering some of these groups were banned before 2003. And so that itself manifested into sort of a new wave of dysfunction and injury that we see in Iraq. And that created a state that is weak in capacity, that's incapable of responding to a lot of crises. You mentioned climate change, for example. And one way we can see how the state is weak in responding is that every time there's a water shortage, and Iraq is one of the most water insecure places on earth, Iraqi leaders, when they try to negotiate with Turkey or with Iran, oftentimes these negotiations don't lead to anywhere. And so we are talking about a state that has built on weak foundation, built on a sense of fragmentation, combined with corruption and the hybrid state and so on, that is really unequipped to handle crises, whether economic or political or climate related. Although I have to say that when we speak of injury, Iraq is still injured today. If you walk around Baghdad, it doesn't, it's not a sense of nostalgia to the past, but as someone who lived and was raised in Baghdad, and this is something really hurt me when I walk around and see it, you don't see the palm trees, you see malls and you see houses that are fragmented instead of a house for a family. Now you see different cubes for different families. So that there's even, the streets are injured. The city itself is still bleeding from decades of injustice. But I am optimistic. I'm not completely, I don't think it's unsolvable. I think that the state itself may be not very equipped to handle the crises that are facing right now. But I think we are seeing generations of people who did not live under Saddam's regime, who've seen the Iraqi state after 2003, and who are slowly developing a different sense of identity and a different relationship to the state and to political parties. And these different individuals, this new generation, can be the solution for sort of a multiple decade-long injustice and injury that the state and its people have been facing.
It's basically, 2 decades is definitely having a kind of a generational shift.
Mm-hmm.
But you've seen that in also the Tishreen politics, and I want, speaking about the Tishreen politics, I wanted to ask Marsin, because she spoke about the invasion and the impact, the limitations, and the impact on the Tishreen politics, the high expectations, given the invasion and the expectation that someone might intervene at some stage to save Iraq. And I wanted to hear from you on this, and whether the new generation, whether you agree with what Zeinab said about the new generation being the hope for change.
I will start by saying that I couldn't agree more with what Zeinab said. Her description of both the optimism that Baghdad gives and the sadness that it creates of the generational change that's very visible is, I have nothing more to add to that. It's exactly the description I would have given. So I'll put this in context. Mohanad, you're alluding to my often tweeted and written discussion of Iraq having a sense of exceptionalism that was developed in 2003. What I mean by that is when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, it really created the sense that it has grown over the years, that the international community will intervene to make big changes in Iraq when necessary, including, toppling a dictatorship, or, later on getting involved in the war against ISIS, so that when we are ever about to hit a very big crisis, there will be an intervention of some sorts. It doesn't have to be an invasion. It could be something as much as a support. And this is an idea that I saw that the political class expressed in some ways, but also everyday Iraqis. If you followed the rhetoric at Tishreen in different times, there were moments when there were genuine questions about, can the UN get involved, asking for very high levels of monitoring and observation for the elections, for example. And I wrote an article about how what some Iraqis wanted from the UN was something that the UN rarely gives, and particularly not to countries like Iraq, who, of course, to an Iraqi, it's not doing very well, but compared to many other countries that actually need a very high level of UN observation and monitoring, it's not quite at that level. So this sense of exceptionalism was one of those not frequently spoken of consequences of the war. This idea that Iraqis, it strips of agency in a very underlying pernicious way. It's not very direct, but it just creates this dependency, or this idea that Iraq has an outsized importance in the world. And at the end of the day, when you engage with regional partners and you talk about Iraq on a regional level, it's an important state within the region, but it's not one of the most important states on the agenda of world superpowers right now. There's much more pressing things, but it's kind of inflated the sense of what Iraq means to the world and has taken away agency from Iraqis inadvertently in that way. And I do notice this often in Iraq. That being said, it's not alarming enough that I feel like Iraqis can't progress past this, or that it's going to have an impact on how we conduct our domestic politics. And I do think it is a generational thing, in that older generations have it more so than younger ones, because they're the ones that had seen more levels of intervention. And younger ones have actually grown up with Iraq being sadly less important in the region and in the world, and having to form an understanding of their country as being one that's still pulling itself together. So I don't think it will have as big of an impact in the next generations, but it's just an interesting observation of the past.
It's interesting to speak about generational politics, especially 20 years after the invasion. But I think it's also useful to look and see whether there's some sort of mobility, generational mobility within the political system itself. We've had the exiled politicians who came after the invasion and kind of defined the political elite in Iraq. And Marsin, I wanted to ask you as well whether you think this Tishrin itself is the ongoing stalemate that we see in Iraq and the sense of despair from its politics and disengagement of the youth or expected disengagement of the youth in politics and elections in the next phase, whether you see that this system is kind of reformable and there's a way forward for the next generation to play a role in politics other than protests, of course, or whether there are, today when you look at the system and you think, this is definitely not reformable and there's no way to change within. I want to hear your reflections on this.
It's a very sensitive topic. I'll say that my bottom line is that I do believe in reform, mainly because I fear the instability of revolution and see really no way out of where we are now. I think Iraq's Tishrin movement, like many other movements in the region, come from a similar despair at the inequality between democracy and socioeconomic rights. So the idea that it's a failed promise, the idea that if you vote and if you work on all these like democratic institutions and actually invest in them as a citizen, you'll also be able to live in an equal society that, where you're guaranteed healthcare and education and a decent life. And this was a failed promise of not just Iraq, but also many countries post-Arab Spring, particularly Tunisia is a very stark example of this. And in this way, Tishrin is really no different from the protests in Lebanon, from the protests in other parts of the Middle East. It's all striving to create this equality between political and socioeconomic rights, and an aggravation of the failure to do so. I do think Iraq is better positioned than most states in the region to achieve some gains on this. And I say this not lightly. It's a very difficult process. And I am fully cognizant of the fact that Iraq has arms on the street, which makes everything 100 times more complicated. But at the end of the day, I will say that the past election had surprising results. And many of us weren't expecting to see both the decrease for some parties and the wins for other figures and for other parties. I think the key thing for Iraq is that the small victories that we had in the last election, and there are a handful of victories, are protected and they are promoted so that in the next round of election, people don't fall into despair. I don't blame Iraqis for having a need to delegitimize the system through boycott. This is a natural reaction that many other citizens across the world have. Boycott movements are ubiquitous. It's nothing unique or particularly damning of Iraq. But I think what the last election has shown us is that there is space. And I've interviewed many independents, nonpartisan ones, and many people associated with the protest movement who ran for politics for the first time, for parliament, for the first time in 2021. And, I asked them, how could you run? Were you not afraid of being intimidated, assassinated, anything like that? There's arms on the street. And, there were some of them who said that, yes, they were afraid, but that they believed in a higher cause and they saw this was the only way out. And of course, you'll find plenty of people who tell you that there is no hope in running through reform. But I still think that we are better positioned than many other states in the region to go through this parliamentary route to reform. It'll probably take a few election cycles, an extraordinary will and capacity of civil society, and it will also take continued attention and monitoring and observation from various, from UNAMI or the EU mission or whatever it is, just to have that, that spotlight on the process. But I'm at the end of the day, I'm a reformist when it comes to Iraq, and I will say that it took the U.S. a very long time to ensure equal rights for citizens, for Black Americans. The U.S. considered itself a democracy for so long while lynching and killing, continuing to this day, and in one way, to prey on its citizens. And there's still arms in America, and it's still considered a democracy, and people don't view it in reformist terms. So I think giving Iraq a chance, 20 years isn't a long time. I just don't want to see this country burned to the ground again.
Okay. Thank you, Marsin. Akeel, I wanted to hear your take on this, and especially that you've described the limitations of the current narratives that kind of dominate Iraqi politics. Do you see a way forward through the system? Is it reformable?
Like Marsin, I fear revolutions. I don't want another revolution in Iraq. There is a system put in place 2005. The formal arrangements of the system has lots of space for reforming things from inside, and that should be kept. The problem, and this is a serious problem, and here I disagree with Marsin significantly, is that the behavior or the political class running this system should not stop reform. Let's look at the last election, and I think the danger is here. Yes, a remarkable achievement, October 2021. Fair, transparent election. Fair, not completely, but transparent. Lots of people were surprised. The results stood. The problem is not in the mechanisms themselves and their application, but in the respect or in the observation of the dominant political class of these mechanisms. The party that won the election could not form the government, and not because the system itself didn't allow it. No, there was judicial complicity, arms, the militias, and Iranian intervention. Three things that came and basically changed the rules of the game. During the game, all governments were formed, just 150, half plus one, you would form the government. Now you come to this government in the middle, 3 days or 4 days before the decisive election of the president, they change the rules. The ceiling is higher now. You need 2/3. Okay. I think the danger is here, because if this behavior continues, next election and the other election, people will lose hope that the system allows reform from inside. And we would hear extremist voices becoming mainstream. What is the essence of the election? You win, you rule. You try your luck for 4 years, and then you go at it again. I think this raises the importance of the issue, how to keep the system honest. And here, international presence is important. Public opinion is also important, but that does not deflect from the fact that you cannot reform the system or allow the system to reform itself or allow outsiders to get into the system if you have armed forces not controlled by the state. I disagree with Marsin's comparison between the US and Iraq. Yeah, there are guns in the street in the US, but not militias that would dictate the result or try to change the results of the obligations emerging from the results of transparent election. That challenge is internal, and the major players in the system, the ruling political class, needs to work on this. Yes, they carried the day, because they were losing power, and they thought of it probably extraordinary emergency. It will happen one time until we arrange things so next time we're better prepared for the elections, we will not lose, and we will not need to use militias or, judicial complicity. But, bad things begin this way. It is only this one time, and then it repeats itself next time, and then next time, and then it becomes the new norm. And then at that time, the people lose hope, and the alternative is revolution, which is the worst thing to happen for Iraq. So I think there's still a lot more work. The whole notion about the militia and a fair, transparent, non-politicized judiciary. These two things are very important to reform the system, and they have to come from the major players within the system.
But you're saying specifically that militias is where the power lies. It's not really, these institutions are more kind of formalities and perhaps tools to exercise that power. But the militias are where the real node of power.
I would not say that they have total control, but they are an effective power. And they played a role in this, that the election results did not translate into institutional arrangements where, the winner comes in forms the government. They, in order to dismantle the three-way alliance, the Sadrists and Taqaddum, the Sunnis and the Kurds, what's used in the Iraqi language. Militias bombed Erbil. They threw grenades on Sunni parties. There was the threat of a civil war if the biggest, social component, meaning Shias, the representatives of the biggest social component, I think that's the language they use, is not in power. It was a barely veiled threat, and that did play a role. That the results didn't translate into gains, power gains for the winner, because this is the essence of election. This is the essence of any democracy in the formal sense of the word. You arrange yourself well, you field good candidates, good program, you win. Your win should translate into you assuming power. That did not happen. And it did not happen because of three factors, allowing the Iranian intervention, judicial complicity, where things were reinterpreted to help the losing party, and the power of the militia that tried to redefine the political map. The combined effort of these three led to the election not translating into gains for the winner. This should not happen in the future. Otherwise, the system is closed, and more radical options would emerge from outside the system. That's very dangerous.
Thank you. So many of the problems that you described are kind of formative in the sense that, the political system which was formed or established after the invasion is kind of resulted, along with the conflict and the Iranian intervention and the various political opposition groups. But I wanted to go back with you, Zeinab, back to that formative moment. Reflecting on the political system which was born out of the invasion, what would have been a different path? If you go back and you look at what could have been done differently, and I just wanted to see, whether you have a view of things in terms of the kind of the paths that were drawn or formed by this consociational system, specifically because it was in 2003, and I think there were plenty of examples and samples to look at to try to avert what many could anticipate back then, specifically the corrupt form of politics, the sectarian narratives that came out, the regional interventions, and against this kind of fragile or state of fragility that Iraq was in and remains in.
Great question. Thank you. So I just wanted to just add a little comment about the previous question before moving to the next one, and just say that, systems, any system is a living thing, right? It moves and interacts with its environment. It interacts with the different challenges that emerge. So a functional system is a system that can adjust to the upcoming challenges. And what are the upcoming challenges that the country is facing? There are economic ones, there are environmental ones, there are generational ones, there's people losing trust in their relationship with the state changing and evolving. So these are challenges that the system, a functional good one, can adjust to. Even if actors within the system want to adjust to these things, if there are no existing tools within the system to adjust, then that change will be challenging. So if you think of the Iraqi condition, do we have a state of law that can really adjust and can take account into these things? Do we have functional bureaucracy that can adjust to bureaucratic, environmental and economic and political challenges and so on? So just looking at what we have right now, it seems that the system does not have the capacity or the tools, even if the actors wish to change things, to adjust to the upcoming challenges. So while I'm optimistic that the new generation will have, or at least will call and attempt to create sort of a new alternative version of Iraq, I don't necessarily think it's going to be very peaceful transition, considering everything that exists right now in terms of existing institutions, a lack of capacity and tools to create that sort of peaceful democratic transition. So I am optimistic in some degree, but not optimistic in the form of change. When it comes to the question you just asked in 2003, I think that, not to, say there was only one path for Iraq, but again, like I mentioned earlier, there were multiple factors at that specific moment that were not ideal conditions for democratic transition or a functional transition or a functional state. We're talking, like I mentioned, before 2003, of a state that was already weak, of bureaucracy that was already weak and fragile. We are talking about a one political leader, that, corruption was already there in Iraq. Saddam undermined a lot of the mechanisms that control corruption, because his own family, his own close circle were very corrupt. And so he actively undermined a lot of these tools that we are talking about right now. We're talking about a country that was completely dependent on natural resources. We're talking about a country that did not really recover from two wars, so the infrastructure were really destroyed to withstand, or, it wasn't a condition to stand a drastic change, whether democratic or not. And we're talking, like I mentioned, of a population that was already fatigued and exhausted and injured, to use that language, like internally and externally, emotionally and physically. So a lot of these conditions at that moment, it was, in my opinion, not an ideal moment to really build a functional democratic alternative system. And I think some of the decisions that were made, whether the de-Baathification sort of process, whether the, getting rid of the army, all of these different steps that were taken in these earlier stages really add salt to the injury and really continue to undermine any possible alternative change. One way of doing it was to maintain whatever fractured or weak bureaucracy that existed and attempt to maintain these tools that existed in the past, even if they were not as strong, and not really completely alienate a big portion of the population, and sending them out without resources, without employment, without funding, all of a sudden changing the political structure without alternatives, and kind of let everything loose. That was one way of at least minimizing the impact and minimizing the damage that happened.
These are very, very good points, and I think they apply, also across the region and specifically in post-conflict era, because the traditional way of resolving conflicts is bring the warring factions and the representatives of different communities and try to find a kind of a transitional phase which is acceptable to everyone, so that we can, move on to kind of a peaceful phase. But then this becomes the mode of politics, and it's dysfunctional, and it also creates fragility and invites regional actors to play a more active role. But as you mentioned, de-Baathification was, looking back at it, it was a power grab, but also a kind of it overlooked the reality and the impact that it had on the population, leading to more violence. And but I think from here we can we can ask the question, which is which I think I want to get back to Marsin on this, and see her viewpoint on what could have, looking back at that formative period of politics, what do you think are the main lessons, specifically because we're looking at a region which still has ongoing conflicts, and which needs to be resolved in later phases. What were the main lessons of the post-2003 invasion, in your opinion?
I think there are several lessons that are useful for different actors. I think the one that I've been grappling with the most, and I alluded to in the beginning, is that anyone who has a modicum of understanding of like ethnic politics, of how societies are made up, about how conflict, how civil war happens, could have foreseen very easily that Iraq would not be a smooth process. And so, this is going to sound like a very basic lesson, but interventions should never be premised on wishful thinking or this really delusional idea that you can step into a country that's been decimated by war, that's been decimated by sanctions, that has clear cleavages, and expect violence not to erupt as a result. I think it was asking Iraq too much. It's, so this is actually one of the things that I've been saying around various think tanks a lot these days. And I think one of the things that really confuses me about the war planning, it's, like I said, someone with a modicum of understanding when it comes to politics could have foreseen this. It's astounding to me that no one did. And I think the larger lesson, and I think this applies to Ukraine, for example, is to not let the idea of a black and white war, of a clear enemy and a clear hero, lead you to a position where you're willing to needlessly risk the lives of individuals, and to prolong a conflict for so long simply for ego or for advancing goals that are ultimately illogical when it comes to international politics, or when it comes to what we know about civil war and ethnic politics. That, I think, is the lesson for policymakers broadly, particularly ones thinking about the ones who work in foreign policy making. I think one that's particular to the US is this important lesson that and I think Shadi Hamid is the one who wrote about this much more eloquently than I can say it right now, that what the US wants in the Middle East in terms of a democracy isn't necessarily what America looks like. And that the US needs to be accustomed to the idea that if and when a consolidated democracy emerges in the region, it might not look like a liberal democracy in the American sense, and it might take on a completely different form. And I encourage everyone to read his book for more details about this lesson. But I do think this lesson has also been a byproduct of the Iraq War.
Thank you, Marsin, for that. I wanted to kind of follow up. There's a question from the audience, which was basically about Iraq, kind of an assessment of Iraq's foreign policy in the past 2 decades, and where do you see it going afterwards. And I think that goes back to your point, Akeel, on the Kadhimi's initiative, which I think kind of bore fruit. And Iraq started a process that ended in a major deal, a kind of a defining deal for the region. Is that a kind of also a defining moment for Iraq's foreign policy? Do you see it as also the way forward? Are we going to see another Omani style foreign policy in the region, a mediation ground for these different powers, or you see it just as a limited one-off related to Qadhimi himself?
I mean, one thing to say here to begin with is that Iraq doesn't have a strategy for its foreign policy. It's just like everything else in the, within the state. This is no vision to guide things. Improvisation, the compelling urgency of the moment dictates things, unfortunately. The one with the Qadhimi, I think, was interesting, surprising, and good, because the following government, Mohammed Soudani's government, although it tries to demonize Qadhimi government in other respects, did actually build up on this. And I think that is a positive development. This is new to Iraq, or the Iraqi political culture that tended to see others as enemies or as friends, black and white, what Marsin said. That is true. Very problematic when you don't see a process or, between the two, and there are lots of other colors. What Qadhimi did, intentionally and unintentionally, I don't know, but the point is that these are not our primordial enemies. Then the Sudani government comes and deepens this, and I think out of this, sometimes practice precedes theory. It precedes the vision. You do something, you do it well, you learn from it, you internalize it. You make it a sort of a vision. So I think it bore fruit, and it showed that you could be a positive player, and this can have positive influence on you. And it is, and this is the second point, surprising, and it was also positive. It was well received, by the Iraqi political players, the formal ones, and well received by the people. Just seeing this sort of engagement, the ability to free oneself from this essentialist narrative of good versus bad, so on and so forth. So I think it's a positive thing. I hope it gets institutionalized. It becomes part of a tradition. And there are other things that happened, at the cultural level, or say grassroots level, that really, to me, show that Iraqis are capable or willing, wanting something else based on cooperation, collaboration, engagement with others, seeing themselves as part of the region. The Gulf Cup tournament in Basra, and I mean the huge interest, enthusiasm. How Iraqis embraced one another, how they embrace people from the Gulf countries. It is as if these long years of indoctrination against the Gulf countries, against Wahhabis, against those people who would never accept us as Shias, so on and so forth, and political forces in Iraq invested in this. All of this disappeared. It didn't bear fruit, which is good. So I think there are positive trends. The point is that how to institutionalize them, how to make them part of public culture and part of the behavior of the state. And that is a big challenge for Iraq.
Thank you, Akeel. And there's another question which I think is addressed to Zeinab, which is, please help us understand the ongoing effect and characteristic of the Iraq War's devastation, displacement, and loss of people across Iraq.
Great question. And to understand the effect and of the war on, displacement and so on, there's so much to say. But I think there are probably, again, one of the main thing to kind of keep in mind is that when, with the war specifically, what it did, 2003, like we mentioned, it undermined the structure of the state in many ways and undermined the tools of the state in many ways. And so what that means is also increased dependency on oil production, increased dependency on the natural resource sector, and so on. And so one of the impacts, one of the sort of outcome of that dysfunctional state, and one of the impact of the war on displacement is that it created an Iraq that's unsafe and unsustainable for a lot of people. For example, when we think of the war devastation, other than its impact on the institution, it also created a high level of pollution, for example, from the war itself, from ISIS, and ISIS, when every time it retreated, it will like set fires to multiple oil wells and oil fields. So there's a high level of environmental devastation that was existing and still happening right now, and probably one of the recent form of displacement that we will be seeing, and we are seeing already, is environmental related displacement. So we are seeing approximately, there are reports that approximately 20,000 individuals are being displaced in 2021 due to water shortage. We are seeing, a breakdown in family structures and social structures because of that situation. But the environment alone is not something that is displacing people. It's the environment combined with economic weaknesses and political instability. For example, a lot of these places that are facing environmental challenges are also facing sort of breakdown in law and order. So we are seeing more control over tribal groups. We are seeing more control over militias over these territories, which is forcing people out of their homes and forcing them, to be part of the sort of the internal displaced population. Lack of economic opportunities is also forcing people to be displaced across the country. So there's multiple layers of why people are being moving in and outside of Iraq. If we want to go back a little bit earlier to sort of the early years of the civil war and post 2003, one form of displacement was sort of the targeting of intellectuals, of bureaucrats, of physicians, of lawyers. So it was sort of this almost like planned attempt to target the bureaucratic strength and the strength of society, and alienating and sort of displacing the people who can really create some kind of change and challenge the emerging political and social system in Iraq at that time. And so there is just different layers of displacement. And I also want to highlight something. Oftentimes when we think of displacement, we're thinking of people moving from one place to the next, but there is also identity displacement, and there is also historical displacement. A lot of Iraqis are, even those who are still living in Iraq, living in Baghdad, who have never left. There is this disconnection oftentimes with Iraq, and sometimes there is anger. So there is a displacement of the sense of home, right? Home no longer exists. A safe place to be in is no longer existing, and it hasn't been there for a very long time. So in other words, the war has displaced people physically, emotionally, mentally, in different ways, and it's still till this day displacing people as we speak. And that is a level of damage that will take a very long time to overcome.
Thank you, Zeinab, for this. I just wanted to ask, because we still have 11 minutes, but I wanted to go over the big question, which is, what lies ahead in the future. I mean, big questions, and speaking about the region and the Gulf, as Akeel has mentioned, the same questions today face Iraq, whether diversification, preparing for the post-hydrocarbon era, away from the dependency on oil revenues, climate change, education, also transition from the conflict phase, specifically because we've had the last round of violence. It wasn't far away with the ISIS takeover and the impact of the Syria war. The question of given what lies ahead, and how the region is steering in that direction and is focusing in that direction. Where do you see Iraq heading, and in what phase? I mean, the question that's also asked in Lebanon, I suppose, elsewhere. In what phase do you think the political class will smell the coffee and understand the challenging times lying ahead? Marsin, can you hear me?
Yeah. Sorry, yes. I didn't realize this was directed at me. I thought we were all jumping in. So no, I can start with this. What the future has in store for Iraq. I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind is that it has been 20 years, but it has not been 20 years of stability. And I mean this truly in the security sense. 2003, there was a war, occupation, insurgency. There wasn't stability. 2005 through 2007, there was a very violent civil war. That there was no stability or security there. A brief moment of respite before the ISIS war, which also immediately after there was COVID and there was mass protests. And Iraq now, has finally had a moment of calm. And I think even though it has been 20 years since regime change, it hasn't been many years since we have had a relatively, I say, because there have still been incidents, a secure country. And I say this fully cognizant of where I am in Baghdad right now. I remember when I used to visit, my family's in southern Iraq, when I used to visit during the time of the civil war, there's so many areas you couldn't set foot in outside your small province. And Baghdad was certainly somewhere no one wanted to set foot in. If you remember the news at the time, every other day there was a terrorist bombing that killed hundreds of people. It was it was devastating. It was really a difficult time to do any state building. And so I think that Iraq has more time to get on its feet, and I hope that there will be more security stability going on. You listed a few problems that will confront us in the near future and the far future. I wanted to highlight that the process of repatriation from El Hol camp and the reintegration of ISIS associated or ISIS adjacent families back in Iraqi society is going to be a huge challenge confronting Iraq on the security arena, but it is one that the Iraqi government is working with in close collaboration with the United Nations. So I have an optimistic nature when it comes to Iraq, mainly because I don't have any other choice but to have one, but I am cognizant of the things that we're confronting. Relatedly, I wanted to tie this into more of an institutional continuity since we're discussing the longevity of a stable Iraq. I don't disagree with Akeel when he talks about, in particular, the importance and the work that's been done reaching out to regional allies and developing this relationship that I think truly has reached a high with the Arabian Gulf tournament. And it really has positioned Iraq in a better way. I think this has really been the cumulative work of prime ministers, which we, in Iraq, rarely do we see cumulative work. It's usually there's a new administration and everything starts from scratch, particularly on the economic front. If you speak to the prime minister's economic advisors, they'll tell you that every prime minister starting from scratch, which is not a good strategy. But with the foreign relations, it actually has been cumulative. And it started before Kadhimi. It started with Prime Minister Abadi. And, if you read Catherine Harvey's book, she talks about the overtures that even that Noor al-Maliki, who caused Iraq a lot of chaos in other ways, actually had made overtures towards the Gulf even as back as that time. So this has actually been a cumulative process over the course of various prime ministers, carried on by Kadhimi, carried on by Soudani, and hopefully carried on by Soudani's successors in the future. It's a very positive first step, and seeing this particular institutional momentum gives me hope that if there are enough pressures on different aspects of Iraq's challenges, there will be institutional momentum in other fields as well. I don't think the political class doesn't realize the danger of the situation they're in right now when it comes to public anger. I do think they're cognizant of it. There is a reason that Soudani's entire administration, I laughingly criticize him as the mayor of Baghdad rather than the prime minister of Iraq, given all the sudden infrastructure projects that are being announced, and some of them that I see in the city. But I do think they're cognizant of this change in the Iraqi street.
Now, Marsin, there's a question that I would like all of you to address, which is from the audience: would Saddam Hussein still be in power without the 2003 war? I mean, that's quite a I think a difficult one to answer, but I thought I'll just put it out there.
Can't believe you're making me answer this first. I hate historical counterfactuals, but it is one that
I know. I mean, this is, but this is, I think this is many are asking these days. Intervention, because there's also the assumption that the Iraq War is also kind of a precursor to the various uprisings that happened in the region, the 2005 uprising that happened in Lebanon and otherwise. But it's also difficult to tell. But I just wanted to hear whether you have an answer for this.
I mean, I can give you one answer. There's so many different paths that Iraq could have taken. Iraq did try to rise against Saddam in 1991. Some parts were successful, Kurdistan region, and some parts were not successful. I think Iraq, like any other state in the region, would have reached a boiling point with the dictatorship and would have probably tried something like the Arab Spring at some point. I do think a popular uprising in Iraq with Saddam Hussein might have led us to where Syria is today, to a long-term civil war, given the various interests in Iraq's in the region, given the ethno-religious fractionalization of the country, which if Saddam had remained in power for another 20 years, would have probably been exacerbated. There's also the counterfactual that Saddam might have died to natural causes between then and now, and we would have seen some kind of power grab among his highest officials. So there's so many ways to go. But I think the bottom line is that there is an appetite in the region for better governance, and Iraq is no exception.
Thank you, Marsin. Akeel, any final words before the...
Yeah. Had it not been for the U.S. invasion in 2003, we would be most likely now ruled Iraqis by Qusay Saddam Hussein. I think Iraqis, overwhelming majority at the time, and probably I would say now, I'm sure, but we're enthusiastic to see the end of the regime, regardless who did the ending, whether the U.S., the UN, aliens from the outside world, whoever. I think there is that basic acknowledgement. Society was exhausted, desperate, impoverished, and the U.S. Invasion that toppled Saddam came to people as salvation. At the moment, that's how they felt it. Political correctness now might dictate something else, but in terms of historical memory, that was the dominant feeling. And I think even polls done at the time reflected that, 88 or 92%, like the first 6 months, I think this poll was done. Iraqis were appreciative of the fact that Saddam is gone. This is not a statement about the U.S. It's a statement about where they were. And I agree with Marsin. It's a process. It's a long process, expensive, bloody sometimes, unfortunately. But the worst times are behind us. That's my sentiment. Thank you.
Thank you, Akeel. Zeinab, any final words on this?
If you ever lived under Saddam Hussein's regime, there's a saying that saying among us who lived under his regime is that Saddam will never die because he left such a horrible impact on the population. So there was this almost like notion that he is this mythical creature, that he's never going to go away. But he's gone, and it's difficult to predict what would happen if there was no invasion in 2003. It's challenging to predict that. But I think that what we can do is focus on where we are right now. And where we are right now is a country that is facing a lot of very significant challenges. And so in the best interests of the political elites right now, hybrid actors, whether inside or outside the state, is to attempt to adjust the system that they've been part of for a very long time, because it's no longer going to be able to survive, considering the challenges that the country is facing. Without that, I am, seeing that probably the worst is ahead of us, not behind us.
Thank you, Zeinab. I would like to thank all of our esteemed speakers for joining us, for your input and for your time. And also would like to thank the audience for tuning in. And I hope you have a great week, and thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.